The year was 1887, and death had claimed more souls in Copper Ridge than the preacher could count. They found Doc Morrison's medical bag abandoned beside Miller's Creek, still wet with morning dew and someone else's blood. The townfolk whispered that the good doctor had finally met his match, but 17-year-old Jake Hutchins knew better. He'd seen the tracks leading into Devil's Canyon, tracks that told a story the sheriff was too scared to follow. What Jake didn't know was that following those footsteps would lead him straight into the heart of the most dangerous secret the frontier had ever buried. Before we roll back time, tell us where you're tuning in from, and hit subscribe for more Wild West tales. The autumn wind howled through the narrow streets of Copper Ridge like a wounded animal, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and the promise of an early winter. Jake Hutchins pulled his worn hat low over his eyes as he crouched behind the weathered fence post near the livery stable, watching Sheriff Brennan examine the abandoned medical bag for the third time that morning. "Ain't nothing here but blood and bandages," the sheriff muttered, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Doc Morrison's gone, and that's the end of it." But Jake knew it wasn't the end. He'd been watching Doc Morrison for weeks, ever since his own mother had taken ill with the fever that was claiming folks left and right in these parts. The doc had saved her life with medicines Jake had never seen before, bottles filled with clear liquids that seemed to cure what even the traveling medicine men couldn't touch. The townspeople of Copper Ridge had grown to depend on Doc Morrison over the past 2 years since he'd arrived from back east. He was a quiet man with steady hands and kind eyes, always ready to ride out to the most dangerous corners of the territory when someone needed healing. But he was also a man with secrets, and Jake had noticed things others missed. Like how the doc's horse always came back cleaner than when it left, even after rides through the dusty canyon country. Like how he carried 2 medical bags instead of one, and how he never let anyone see inside the smaller leather satchel. Like how he sometimes disappeared for days at a time, claiming he was visiting patients in distant settlements that nobody else had ever heard of. Jake's own troubles with the law had started 3 months ago when he'd been caught stealing bread from Murphy's store. It wasn't the first time hunger had driven him to take what he needed, and Sheriff Brennan had made it clear that the next offense would land him in territorial prison. But it was Doc Morrison who'd stepped in, paying for the bread and offering Jake work mucking out his stable in exchange for meals. The doc had never asked questions about Jake's past or why a 17-year-old was living alone in a shack on the outskirts of town. He'd simply treated Jake with the same quiet respect he showed everyone else, and for the first time in years, Jake had felt like maybe there was hope for a different kind of life. Now that hope was gone, vanished like morning, mist in the desert sun. "Sheriff!" called out Mary Ellen Patterson, the banker's daughter, as she hurried down Main Street with her skirts kicking up dust. "My father says you need to organize a proper search party. Doc Morrison might be injured somewhere." Sheriff Brennan shook his head. "Miss Patterson, we searched every inch of ground between here and the creek, found his horse wandering loose near the Morrison place, found his bag by the water, but no sign of the doc himself. Could be he fell in and got swept downstream. Could be he ran into trouble with bandits. Either way, searching Devil's Canyon would be suicide for any man fool enough to try it." Jake's ears perked up at the mention of Devil's Canyon. That was where he'd seen the tracks, boot prints heading toward the narrow passage that led into the most treacherous part of the territory. The canyon was known to be the hideout of various outlaw gangs, and most law-abiding folks gave it a wide berth. But Jake wasn't exactly law-abiding, and he knew how to move quiet through rough country. As the sheriff and Mary Ellen continued their conversation, Jake slipped away from his hiding spot and made his way to Doc Morrison's small house on the edge of town. The place stood empty now, its windows dark and its door secured with a simple latch. Jake had helped the doc with chores around the property often enough to know where he kept a spare key hidden under a loose board on the back porch. The house felt strange without the doc's presence. Medical books lined the shelves, and glass, bottles filled with various powders and liquids stood arranged on a workbench near the window. But something was missing. Jake walked through the rooms carefully, trying to figure out what felt wrong. Then it hit him. The small leather satchel was gone, the one the doc always carried but never opened in front of anyone else. If Doc Morrison had truly been attacked or had suffered an accident, both of his medical bags would have been left behind. The That one was missing suggested he'd left town deliberately. Jake found what he was looking for in the doc's bedroom. Tucked under the mattress was a hand-drawn map of the local territory, with several locations marked in the doc's careful handwriting. Most of the marks indicated known settlements and ranches, but one caught Jake's attention. In the heart of Devil's Canyon, someone had drawn a small cross and written the words, Hope Springs. Jake had never heard of any place called Hope Springs, and he'd lived in this territory his whole life. He folded the map carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket. If Doc Morrison had gone to Devil's Canyon voluntarily, then maybe he wasn't dead after all. Maybe he was in trouble and needed help. Either way, Jake was going to find out. Jake spent the rest of the day gathering supplies for what he knew would be a dangerous journey. He couldn't afford to buy provisions from the general store, so he had to be creative. A few potatoes from the field behind the church, some hardtack from the barrel outside Murphy's store, and a canteen filled from the public well would have to do. His horse was a scrappy Mustang gelding named Dusty that he'd won in a poker game the previous year. The animal wasn't much to look at, but he was sure-footed and had enough endurance to handle rough country. More importantly, Dusty was quiet and wouldn't betray their presence with unnecessary noise. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jake saddled his horse and rode out of Copper Ridge. He took the long way around town to avoid being seen, following cattle trails and deer paths instead of the main road. The entrance to Devil's Canyon was a narrow gap between two towering rock formations that cast long shadows even in daylight. Local legends claimed the canyon was cursed, that men who entered it were never seen again. Jake had always figured the legends were just stories meant to keep folks away from the outlaw hideouts, but now, sitting on his horse at the mouth of the canyon with darkness closing in around him, he wasn't so sure. The wind whistled through the rock formations with an eerie sound that made Dusty's ears twitch nervously. Jake patted the horse's neck and spoke in a low, reassuring voice. Easy, boy. We're just gonna take a look around. If Doc Morrison came this way, then it can't be as dangerous as folks make it out to be. But even as he spoke the words, Jake wasn't entirely convinced they were true. The tracks he'd spotted earlier were still visible in the soft earth near the canyon entrance. Boot prints. Definitely human. And definitely heading into the canyon, rather than coming out of it. Jake dismounted and examined them more closely by the light of the rising moon. The prints were made by someone wearing good quality boots, the kind a doctor from back east might own. They were accompanied by what looked like the tracks of a pack mule, which made sense if Doc Morrison had been carrying extra supplies for an extended journey. Jake remounted Dusty and urged the horse forward into the canyon. The walls rose high, on either side, blocking out most of the moonlight and creating a narrow corridor of deep shadow. The sound of the horse's hooves on stone seemed unnaturally loud in the enclosed space, and Jake found himself jumping at every echo. After about an hour of slow, careful progress, the canyon began to widen out into a series of connected valleys. Jake consulted the doc's map by matchlight, trying to determine which direction to take. According to the crude drawings, Hope Springs should be somewhere to the northwest, in a valley that the map showed as being well hidden behind a series of false turns and dead ends. The perfect place for someone to disappear, Jake thought grimly. He was just folding the map when he heard voices echoing off the canyon walls. Jake quickly extinguished his match and listened carefully. The voices were coming from somewhere ahead and to the left, and they didn't sound friendly. "Told you we should have killed him when we had the chance," one voice was saying. "Boss wants him alive," replied another. "Says the doc knows things that could be worth more than gold." Jake's heart began to race. They were talking about Doc Morrison, and it sounded like he was being held prisoner somewhere nearby. Jake tied Dusty's reins to a stunted juniper tree and crept forward on foot, following the sound of the voices. The conversation was coming from a campfire built in a natural alcove in the canyon wall. Jake counted 3 men sitting around the flames, their faces harsh and weathered in the flickering light. He recognized one of them, Bill Sutter, a known cattle rustler who'd been run out of several towns for various crimes. "How much longer are we going to sit here babysitting some old sawbones?" complained the man Jake didn't recognize. As long as it takes, Sutter replied. Boss says this doc's got information about some kind of hidden valley where folks have been getting rich without nobody knowing about it. Says there's enough gold and silver in that place to make us all wealthy men. And you believe that hogwash? Asked the third man. I believe in gold, Sutter said. And I believe in making folks talk when they don't want to. Give it another day or two, and that doc will tell us everything we want to know. Jake had heard. Enough. Doc Morrison was alive, but he was being held prisoner by men who wanted to force information out of him. Jake needed to find where they were keeping the doc and figure out a way to free him. But first, he needed to get back to Dusty. Before these outlaws discovered his presence, he began to creep backward, placing each step carefully to avoid making noise. He was almost clear of the alcove when his boot knocked against a loose stone, sending it skittering across the ground with a sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the quiet night. What was that? One of the men hissed. Jake pressed himself against the canyon wall and held his breath, hoping the shadows would hide him. He could hear the outlaws moving around, checking their surroundings. Probably just a coyote, Sutter said after a moment. But keep your eyes open. Don't want no surprises. Jake waited until their conversation resumed before making his way back to where he'd left Dusty. His hands were shaking as he untied the horse's reins. He'd found Doc Morrison, but rescuing him was going to be a lot more complicated than he'd expected. Jake spent a restless night camped in a secluded spot deeper in the canyon, away from the outlaw camp, but close enough to keep watch on their activities. When dawn broke over the canyon rim, he was already awake, studying Doc Morrison's map and trying to make sense of what he'd overheard. The outlaws had mentioned a hidden valley where people were getting rich, and they believed Doc Morrison knew something about it. Jake examined the map more carefully, noting that Hope Springs was marked in an area that seemed to be surrounded by natural barriers, exactly the kind of place that might remain hidden from casual travelers. Around mid-morning, Jake watched as two of the outlaws rode out of their camp, heading deeper into the canyon. Sutter remained behind, presumably to guard their prisoner. This might be Jake's best chance to locate Doc Morrison and attempt a rescue. Jake left Dusty hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees and made his way on foot toward the outlaw camp. Moving from rock to rock and staying in the shadows, he managed to get close enough to see the layout of their temporary stronghold. The camp was situated in a natural amphitheater, surrounded by high walls of red sandstone. There was only one way in or out, which made it an excellent defensive position, but also meant that anyone trying to escape would be easily trapped. Jake could see Sutter sitting near the remains of the previous night's fire, cleaning his rifle with careful attention. But where was Doc Morrison? Jake circled around the camp's perimeter, looking for any sign of the missing doctor. Finally, in the deepest part of the alcove, he spotted what looked like a cave entrance partially hidden behind a pile of boulders. If he were holding a prisoner, that's where Jake would put him. The problem was getting there without being seen by Sutter. The outlaw had positioned himself where he could observe the entire camp area, and there wasn't enough cover to allow Jake to reach the cave undetected. Jake was still trying to figure out his next move when he heard the sound of approaching horses. The two outlaws who had left earlier were returning, and they weren't alone. A fourth man rode with them, someone Jake didn't recognize but who carried himself with the bearing of a leader. "Any trouble while we were gone?" the newcomer asked Sutter. "Quiet as a grave," Sutter replied, "though I thought I heard something moving around last night. Might have been an animal." The leader dismounted and walked toward the cave entrance. "Time to have another talk with our guest. 3 days should have been enough to soften him up." Jake watched as the man disappeared into the cave, emerging a few minutes later with Doc Morrison. Even from a distance, Jake could see that the doctor looked tired and beaten, but he was walking under his own power and didn't appear to be seriously injured. "Doc," the leader said in a conversational tone, "I'm going to ask you one more time. Where is Hope Springs, and what makes it so special?" "Doc." Morrison raised his head and looked the outlaw leader straight in the eye. "I've told you before, Mr. Crenshaw, I don't know what you're talking about." Crenshaw. Jake had heard that name before. Samuel Crenshaw was supposed to be the leader of one of the most dangerous outlaw gangs in the territory. If these men were working for him, then Doc Morrison was in more trouble than Jake had realized. "That's a shame, Doc," Crenshaw said. Because I know you've been making regular trips into this canyon for months. I know you've been treating folks who live in places that don't appear on any map. And I know that some of those folks have been paying you with gold nuggets that are purer than anything that's come out of the established mines. Jake felt his stomach drop. So that's what this was about. Someone had discovered that Doc Morrison knew the location of a secret community of prospectors, and they wanted to rob them. Even if what you're suggesting were true, Doc Morrison said quietly, I took an oath to do no harm. That includes betraying the trust of my patients. Crenshaw's face darkened. Your principles are admirable, Doc, but they're about to get you killed. I'll give you until tomorrow morning to reconsider. After that, we'll start getting creative with our methods of persuasion. Jake had seen enough. He needed to get Doc Morrison out of there before these outlaws decided to resort to torture. But he also needed help. There was no way he could take on 4 armed men by himself. As he made his way back to where he'd left Dusty, Jake's mind was racing. Who could he trust? Sheriff Brennan had already written off Doc Morrison as dead and wouldn't be interested in organizing a rescue mission into outlaw territory. The townspeople of Copper Ridge were decent folks, but they weren't fighters. Then, Jake remembered something Doc Morrison had told him weeks ago. The doctor had mentioned that he sometimes worked with a man named Tom Brennan, the sheriff's own brother, who worked as a deputy in the neighboring town of Pine Valley. Tom Brennan had a reputation as a man who wasn't afraid of a fight and who had little patience for outlaws of any stripe. It was a long shot, but it might be Doc Morrison's only chance. Jake mounted Dusty and rode hard out of Devil's Canyon, pushing the horse as fast as he dared over the rocky terrain. Pine Valley was a full day's ride from Copper Ridge under normal circumstances, but Jake was determined to make it in half that time. Pine Valley was smaller than Copper Ridge, but had a more prosperous look to it, with well-maintained buildings and busy streets that suggested a thriving local economy. Jake rode straight to the sheriff's office, his horse lathered with sweat and his own clothes covered with dust from the hard ride. Deputy Tom Brennan looked up from his desk as Jake burst through the door. He was a younger version of his brother, but with harder eyes and a more direct manner. You're Jake Hutchins from Copper Ridge, Tom said without preamble. My brother told me to keep an eye out for you. Said you might cause trouble in his town. Deputy Brennan, I need your help, Jake said, fighting to catch his breath. Doc Morrison isn't dead like everyone thinks. He's being held prisoner by Samuel Crenshaw's gang in Devil's Canyon. Tom's expression changed immediately. Crenshaw? You sure about that? Saw him with my own eyes. They're trying to force Doc Morrison to tell them the location of some secret settlement where folks have been mining gold. They're planning to torture him if he doesn't talk by tomorrow morning. Tom stood up and reached for his hat and gun belt. How do I know you're telling the truth? Could be you're trying to set up some kind of ambush. Jake pulled out Doc Morrison's map and spread it on the deputy's desk. I found this in the doc's house. Look here. He's marked a place called Hope Springs right in the heart of Devil's Canyon. I heard Crenshaw's men talking about it. They know. The doc's been making trips to treat folks in hidden settlements and they want to rob them. Tom studied the map carefully. I've heard rumors about prospectors working claims in areas that are supposed to be played out. Never gave them much credence, but if Morrison's been treating folks out there... He looked up at Jake. Why should I trust you? Far as I know, you're just another young outlaw looking to make trouble. Because Doc Morrison saved my mother's life, Jake said simply. And because he's the only person in this territory who ever treated me like I was worth something. I'm not asking you to trust me, Deputy. I'm asking you to help save a good man's life. Tom was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. All right, Hutchins. But we do this my way. I've got 2 experienced men I can call on, Jim Crawford and Pete Martinez. Both of them have fought Indians and outlaws, and both of them hate Crenshaw's gang. Can you get us into Devil's Canyon without being seen? I can get us close, Jake said. But once we're in there, it's going to be dangerous for all of us. Everything worth doing is dangerous, Tom replied. Let's go round up my men and get moving. We've got maybe 18 hours before Crenshaw starts cutting pieces off the good doctor. Within 2 hours, Jake found himself riding back toward Devil's Canyon with 3 experienced lawmen. Jim Crawford was a grizzled former cavalry sergeant who'd fought in the war between the states. Pete Martinez was a soft-spoken man with quick hands and sharp eyes who'd worked as a scout for the Army. Both men had volunteered for the mission as soon as Tom explained what was at stake. Crenshaw's gang has been hitting settlements all across this territory, Crawford explained as they rode. They're smart, they're well-armed, and they don't leave witnesses. If they've got Doc Morrison, then time's running short. What's the plan once we reach the canyon? Jake asked. Depends on what we find, Tom replied. Ideally, we go in quiet. Get the doc out and leave before anyone knows we were there. If that doesn't work, we'll have to get creative. As they approached Devil's Canyon, the sun was beginning to set behind the western mountains. Jake led the group to the same hidden spot where he'd camped the previous night, and they made their plans by the light of a carefully shielded lantern. The Outlaw camp is about half a mile from here, Jake explained, sketching the layout in the dirt. They've got Doc Morrison in a cave at the back of a natural amphitheater. There's only one way in or out, which makes it a perfect trap if things go wrong. How many men? Martinez asked. I saw 4 yesterday, including Crenshaw. But there might be more. Tom studied Jake's crude map. Crawford, you and Martinez circle around to the high ground above the camp. If shooting starts, you'll have clear shots at anyone trying to escape. Jake and I will go in on foot and try to reach the dock. What if they've got guards posted? Jake asked. Then we deal with them quietly, Tom said grimly. This is Doc Morrison. We're talking about. He's saved the lives of half the people in this territory. We don't leave him to be tortured by scum like Crenshaw. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light for them to move through the canyon without using lanterns, but also making it harder to remain hidden in the shadows. Jake led the way, moving as quietly as possible over the rocky ground, with Tom Brennan close behind. Crawford and Martinez had split off to climb to the high ground overlooking the Outlaw camp. The plan was to give them 30 minutes to get into position before Jake and Tom made their approach to the cave where Doc Morrison was being held. As they drew closer to the camp, Jake could see the glow of a fire and hear the low murmur of voices. He held up his hand to signal Tom to stop, then crept forward to assess the situation. There were still 4 outlaws in the camp, but their positions had changed since the previous day. Crenshaw was sitting near the fire, apparently cleaning. His pistol, Sutter, was standing guard at the entrance to the natural amphitheater, while the other 2 men were playing cards on a blanket spread near the horses. Jake crept back to where Tom was waiting. 4 men, he whispered. 1 at the entrance. 3 near the fire. The cave where they're keeping Doc Morrison is about 50 yards from the fire. Tom nodded and checked his pocket watch. Crawford and Martinez should be in position by now. You ready for this? Jake's heart was pounding, but he nodded. This was his chance to repay Doc Morrison for all the kindness the man had shown him. He wasn't going to let fear stop him now. They moved forward together, staying in the deepest shadows along the canyon wall. The plan was simple. Tom would create a distraction at the camp entrance while Jake circled around to the cave and freed Doc Morrison. If everything went according to plan, they'd have the doctor out of the canyon before the outlaws knew what was happening. If things went wrong, Crawford and Martinez would provide covering fire while they all fought their way out. Jake reached the cave entrance without being detected. The opening was partially blocked by boulders, creating a narrow gap that would be difficult for a man to squeeze through quickly. Jake could hear movement inside the cave, and what sounded like Doc Morrison's voice speaking quietly to someone. "Doc?" Jake whispered as loudly as he dared. The movement inside the cave stopped abruptly. "Jake? Jake Hutchins, is that you?" came Doc Morrison's voice from inside. "Yes, sir. I'm here to get you out. Are you hurt?" "I'm all right, son, but there's something you need to know. I'm not alone in here." Jake felt his stomach drop. Had the outlaws left a guard inside the cave with the doctor? There are 3 other people with me, Doc Morrison continued. Folks from Hope Springs who were captured when they tried to help me escape yesterday. If we're leaving, we all leave together. Jake's mind raced. The plan had been complicated enough with just 1 person to rescue. Now there were 4, and Tom Brennan was expecting Jake to signal him when Doc Morrison was ready to move. "Doc, I've got help with me, but we weren't planning on 4 people. This is going to be a lot harder than we thought. I understand, son, but I won't abandon these people. They came to help me, and they're in danger because of it. Jake closed his eyes and tried to think. Tom was waiting for his signal, and every minute they delayed increased the chance of being discovered. But Doc Morrison was right. They couldn't leave innocent people to be tortured or killed by Crenshaw's gang. All right, Doc, we'll figure it out. Can everyone in there travel? Yes, though one of the women is pretty shaken up. Her name's Sarah, and this is her first time away from Hope Springs. Jake made his decision. He cupped his hands around his mouth and made the sound of a night bird, the signal he and Tom had agreed on to indicate that the rescue was ready to begin. A moment later, he heard Tom's voice calling out from the camp entrance. This is Deputy Tom Brennan. You men are surrounded. Come out with your hands up! The response was immediate and violent. Gunshots erupted throughout the camp as the outlaws grabbed their weapons and began firing at shadows. Jake could hear Crenshaw shouting orders, trying to organize his men's defense. Now, Doc, Jake called out. Everyone out of the cave, fast as you can. Doc Morrison emerged first, followed by 3 other people, an older man with a gray beard, a middle-aged woman, and a younger woman who looked barely out of her teens and was clearly terrified. This way, Jake said, pointing toward the back of the amphitheater where the canyon wall was lowest. We need to get to high ground. The sound of gunfire was getting closer as the outlaws spread out to search for their attackers. Jake could see muzzle flashes from the high ground where Crawford and Martinez were positioned, and he hoped Tom was finding adequate cover near the camp entrance. Jake, Doc Morrison said as they climbed toward the canyon rim. The people of Hope Springs are in terrible danger. Crenshaw knows the general area where their settlement is located, and if he can't force the information out of me, he'll start searching systematically until he finds them. Then we need to warn them, Jake replied, helping the frightened young woman over a particularly difficult section of rock. They reached the top of the canyon wall just as the gunfight below began to intensify. Jake could see Tom Brennan moving from rock to rock, trying to keep the outlaws pinned down while Crawford and Martinez provided covering fire from above. There, called out the older man from Hope Springs, pointing toward a narrow ledge that led along the canyon rim. That path will take us away from the fighting. But even as they began to move along the ledge, Jake could see that their troubles were far from over. Crenshaw had realized that his prisoners were escaping, and he was organizing his men to pursue them. The ledge along the canyon rim was treacherous in daylight and nearly suicidal at night, but it was their only option for escape. Jake led the way, testing each step carefully before putting his full weight on the rock. Behind him, Doc Morrison was helping Sarah, the young woman from Hope Springs, while the older man and woman followed as quickly as they could manage. The sound of gunfire from the camp below was beginning to fade as they put distance between themselves and the outlaws. But Jake knew their reprieve would be temporary. Crenshaw and his men would be coming after them as soon as they could organize a pursuit. How much farther? Doc Morrison asked, breathing heavily from the exertion of the climb. About another 100 yards to where the ledge widens out, replied the older man from Hope Springs. My name's Matthew Kane, by the way. This is my wife, Elena, and Sarah here is my daughter. Jake nodded but kept his attention focused on the path ahead. One slip would send any of them tumbling into the canyon, and there was no margin for error. They reached the wider section of the ledge just as Jake heard the sound of horses approaching from below. Crenshaw had mounted his men and was following, their trail along the canyon floor. In the moonlight, Jake could see the riders moving fast, and he realized they would be overtaken within minutes unless they could find a better hiding place. This way, Elena Kane said, pointing to what looked like a crack in the canyon wall. There's a passage here that leads to the back country. It's narrow, but horses can't follow. They squeezed through the narrow opening one at a time, emerging into a hidden valley that Jake had never seen before despite having lived in the territory his entire life. The valley was perhaps a mile wide and surrounded by high cliffs on all sides. A small stream ran through the center, and Jake could see evidence of human habitation, gardens, corrals, and several well-built cabins. Welcome to Hope Springs, Matthew Kane said quietly. Jake stared in amazement. I never knew this place existed. Very few people do, Doc Morrison said. The entrance is almost impossible to find unless you know exactly where to look. The folks here have been living quietly, mining just enough gold and silver to meet their needs and staying out of the territorial disputes that have plagued other settlements. But Crenshaw knows about it now, Sarah said, her voice shaking with fear. He'll bring more men and search until he finds the entrance. Doc Morrison nodded grimly. Which is why we need to get word to the territorial authorities. Crenshaw's gang has committed crimes all across this region. If we can provide evidence of their location and activities, the army might be willing to take action. Jake was about to respond when he heard the sound of gunshots echoing from the canyon behind them. Tom Brennan, Crawford, and Martinez were still fighting for their lives, and Jake had left them to face Crenshaw's gang alone. I have to go back, Jake said. Son, that would be suicide, Doc Morrison protested. Those men knew the risks when they agreed to help with the rescue. They came because I asked them to, Jake replied. Deputy Brennan didn't have to believe my story, and his men didn't have to volunteer for a dangerous mission. If they die because of my decisions, I'll never be able to live with myself. Matthew Kane stepped forward. There's another way. We've got 6 good men here in Hope Springs. Men who know this country better than anyone and who have their own reasons for wanting to see Crenshaw's gang destroyed. If you're determined to go back, you won't go alone. Within minutes, Jake found himself part of an impromptu war party that included Doc Morrison, the Kane family, and 6 armed men from Hope Springs. They were a mixture of former soldiers, prospectors, and homesteaders who had come to the Hidden Valley seeking peace but were prepared to fight when necessary. The quickest way back to the canyon is through Devil's Throat, explained a man named Pete Dawson, who seemed to be the unofficial leader of the Hope Springs men. It's a narrow passage that opens onto the canyon floor about half a mile from where the fighting started. As they made their way through the darkness, Jake couldn't help but think about how much his life had changed in the past few days. 3 days ago, he'd been a young outlaw with no prospects and no hope for the future. Now he was part of a desperate mission to save the lives of men who had risked everything to help him rescue Doc Morrison. The passage, called Devil's Throat, was aptly named. It was a narrow crack between 2 massive rock formations that required them to move in single file. The walls were so close together in some places that Jake had to turn sideways to squeeze through. They emerged from the passage just as the gunfight in the canyon reached a crescendo. Jake could see muzzle flashes from at least a dozen different positions, and it was clear that Crenshaw had been reinforced by additional men who must have been camped elsewhere in the canyon system. Tom and his men are pinned down behind those boulders, Pete Dawson observed, pointing to a cluster of rocks about 200 yards away. Crenshaw's got them surrounded. Doc Morrison checked his medical bag. I count at least 3 wounded. Men down there, maybe more. If we're going to help them, we need to move fast. Jake felt his stomach tighten with anxiety. The odds were heavily against them, and there was a very real possibility that none of them would survive the next few minutes. But Tom Brennan and his men had risked their lives to help rescue Doc Morrison, and Jake wasn't going to abandon them now. All right, he said, checking his rifle one more time. Let's go save some lawmen. The rescue plan was simple, but dangerous. Pete Dawson and 3 of his men would circle around to get behind Crenshaw's position, while Jake, Doc Morrison, and the remaining Hope Springs settlers created a diversion by attacking from the opposite side. The goal was to give Tom Brennan and his men enough breathing room to reposition themselves and turn the tide of the battle. Jake crept through the rocks and scrub brush, his heart pounding with each step. He'd been in fights before, but nothing like this. This was war, and men were going to die before the sun came up. Easy, son, Doc Morrison whispered beside him. Remember, we're not trying to be heroes. We just need to make enough noise to confuse Crenshaw's men and give our friends a chance to escape. But even as the doctor spoke, Jake could see that the situation was worse than they'd realized. Tom Brennan and his men were trapped behind a small cluster of boulders, completely surrounded by outlaws who were closing in from all sides. Crawford appeared to be wounded, and Pete Martinez was down to his last few rounds of ammunition. Change of plans, Jake said grimly. We can't wait for Dawson's men to get into position. If we don't act now, those lawmen are going to be overrun. Doc Morrison nodded reluctantly. Then we make our own luck. You take the left side, I'll take the right. Try to make them think there are more of us than there really are. Jake had never thought of Doc Morrison as a fighting man, but the doctor moved through the rocks with the confidence of someone who'd seen combat before. Within seconds, they were both in position and ready to begin their desperate gambit. The first shots rang out simultaneously, Jake and Doc Morrison firing at muzzle flashes in the darkness. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Several of Crenshaw's men turned away from their assault on Tom Brennan's position to deal with this new threat from behind. "There's more of them," Jake heard one outlaw shout. "We're being attacked from the rear." Jake worked the lever on his rifle and fired again, aiming at a shadow moving between two large rocks. He heard a cry of pain and knew he'd hit his target. Beside him, Doc Morrison was firing with methodical precision, each shot carefully aimed and timed. The distraction worked better than Jake had dared hope. Tom Brennan and his men seized the opportunity to break out of their trapped position, moving to higher ground where they could bring their own weapons to bear more effectively. Within minutes, the tide of the battle began to turn. But Crenshaw wasn't finished yet. Jake could hear the outlaw leader shouting orders, trying to rally his men for a counterattack. And then Jake heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of more horses approaching from deeper in the canyon. "Reinforcements," Doc Morrison said grimly. "Crenshaw must have had more men camped elsewhere." Jake counted the muzzle flashes and estimated that at least 8 additional outlaws were joining the fight. Even with the arrival of Pete Dawson and the other Hope Springs men, they were going to be badly outnumbered. "Doc," Jake said, "maybe it's time to consider retreating. We got you away from Crenshaw, and that was the main objective." But Doc Morrison shook his head. "These men came to help us, Jake. Tom Brennan and his deputies, the folks from Hope Springs, they're all here because they believe in doing what's right. If we run now, Crenshaw will hunt down every person who participated in this rescue. The only way any of us are safe is if we finish this fight." Jake knew the doctor was right, but he also knew their chances of surviving were getting slimmer by the minute. Then he remembered something. The map he'd found in Doc Morrison's house showed several passages leading out of this part of the canyon. If they could lure Crenshaw's gang into one of those narrow defiles, they might be able to turn the outlaws' superior numbers into a disadvantage. "Doc, that map you drew. Are there any places in this canyon where we could bottleneck Crenshaw's men? Somewhere narrow where they couldn't bring all their firepower to bear at once?" Doc Morrison thought for a moment, then nodded. "There's a passage about half a mile from here called Widow's Gap. It's barely wide enough for 2 men to ride side by side, and it opens onto a box canyon with no other exit. If we could lure them in there, they'd be trapped," Jake finished. "But how do we get them to follow us instead of just riding away to fight another day?" "We make them think we're retreating in panic," Doc Morrison said. "And we take something with us that Crenshaw wants more than anything else." Jake looked at the doctor with growing understanding. He still thinks you know secrets about Hope Springs that could make him rich. If he sees you running, he'll follow." "Exactly. But it means one of us has to act as bait while the others get into position at Widow's Gap. It's going to be dangerous." Jake checked his ammunition. He had maybe a dozen rounds left, not enough for a prolonged fight. But if this plan worked, they might be able to end Crenshaw's threat once and for all. "I'll be the bait," Jake said. "I know this country, and Dusty's, fast enough to stay ahead of their horses if I don't push too hard too early." Doc Morrison started to protest, but Jake cut him off. "Doc, you saved my mother's life and you gave me hope when I didn't think I had any future worth living. This is my chance to pay that debt. Besides, I'm probably the best rider here, and if something goes wrong, I've got the best chance of getting away." The plan required precise timing and more than a little luck. Tom Brennan and his men would continue fighting where they were, keeping some of Crenshaw's gang occupied. Pete Dawson and the Hope Springs settlers would make their way to Widow's Gap and set up an ambush. Jake would retrieve Dusty and then make a show of helping Doc Morrison escape, leading Crenshaw and his remaining men into the trap. Jake made his way back to where he'd left his horse, moving carefully through the darkness and avoiding the ongoing gunfight. Dusty was exactly where he'd left him, calm despite the sound of gunfire echoing through the canyon. Easy, boy, Jake whispered as he checked the horse's saddle and bridle. We're about to take the ride of our lives. He led Dusty back toward the battle, staying in the shadows until he was close enough to see the individual combatants. The fighting had spread out over a wider area, with men taking cover behind rocks and trees while they exchanged shots with their enemies. Jake could see Crenshaw directing his men from a position behind a large boulder. The outlaw leader was clearly frustrated by the way the battle was developing. What should have been a simple matter of executing a few lawmen had turned into a running gun battle that was costing him men and ammunition. Jake mounted Dusty and rode boldly into the open, heading straight for where Doc Morrison was positioned. "Doc," he called out, loud enough for everyone in the area to hear. "I've got your horse. Time to get out of here." Doc Morrison played his part perfectly, rising from cover and running toward Jake while appearing to be in a state of panic. "Thank God. You came back, son. These outlaws have us outnumbered 3-1. Jake reached down and pulled Doc Morrison up behind him on Dusty's back. "Hold on tight, Doc. We're getting out of here." The effect was exactly what they'd hoped for. Crenshaw immediately began shouting orders to his men. "Don't let them escape. The Doc knows where the gold is. Follow them." Jake spurred Dusty into a gallop, heading toward Widow's Gap, but not so fast that Crenshaw's men couldn't keep up. He needed to make it look like they were fleeing in panic, while actually leading the outlaws into a carefully prepared trap. Behind them, Jake could hear the thunder of hoofbeats as at least 6 riders took up the pursuit. A few shots were fired, but the bullets went wide. It's difficult to aim accurately from the back of a galloping horse, especially in moonlight. "How far to the gap?" Jake called back to Doc Morrison. "About another quarter mile. Look for a narrow opening between 2 tall rock formations." Jake could see the formations ahead, looking like giant sentinels in the moonlight. The opening between them was barely visible, just a dark slash in the canyon wall that could easily be missed by someone who wasn't looking for it. As they approached Widow's Gap, Jake began to slow Dusty down slightly, making it appear that the horse was getting tired from carrying 2 riders. Behind them, Crenshaw and his men were closing the distance, encouraged by their quarry's apparent exhaustion. Jake guided Dusty into the narrow passage, the horse's hooves echoing loudly off the rock walls on either side. The passage was even narrower than Doc Morrison had described. In some places, Jake's legs almost scraped against the stone walls. They emerged into the box canyon beyond, and Jake could see Pete Dawson and his men positioned among the rocks, at the far end. The Hope Springs settlers had their rifles ready and were waiting for Crenshaw's gang to ride into the trap. Jake rode to the center of the canyon and then turned Dusty around, as if preparing to make a final stand. Doc Morrison slipped down from the horse's back and took cover behind a fallen log, his own rifle ready. "Here they come," Jake said quietly. The first of Crenshaw's men appeared at the mouth of the passage, riding hard and not paying attention to their surroundings. By the time they realized they'd ridden into a trap, it was too late. "Now!" Pete Dawson shouted. The canyon erupted in gunfire as the Hope Springs men opened up on the trapped outlaws. Caught in the open with nowhere to run, Crenshaw's gang found themselves in an impossible situation. Some tried to retreat back through the narrow passage, but Jake and Doc Morrison were firing at them from behind, preventing their escape. The battle was brief, but decisive. Within minutes, most of Crenshaw's men were either dead or wounded, and the outlaw leader himself was calling for surrender. "Don't shoot," Crenshaw yelled, throwing down his pistol. "We give up." Jake rode forward cautiously, keeping his rifle trained on the outlaw leader. "Where are the rest of your men?" "Back at the canyon," Crenshaw replied sullenly. "But they'll have heard the shooting. They'll be coming to investigate." Pete Dawson emerged from his hiding place, his rifle still ready. "Then we'd better finish this quickly and get out of here." But even as he spoke, Jake could hear the sound of more horses approaching the entrance to Widow's Gap. Tom Brennan's voice called out from the passage. "Jake, Doc Morrison, are you all right in there?" "We're fine," Jake called back. "We've got Crenshaw and what's left of his gang." Tom Brennan rode into the box canyon with Crawford and Martinez behind him. Chalai, 3 lawmen looked battered and tired, but they were alive and victorious. The rest of Crenshaw's gang scattered when they realized their boss was gone, Tom reported. Some headed north toward the territorial border, others went south. "We'll organize pauses to hunt them down, but the main threat is over." Jake looked around at the men who had risked their lives to rescue Doc Morrison and protect the people of Hope Springs. Tom Brennan and his deputies, wounded but victorious. Pete Dawson and the Hope Springs settlers, who had left their peaceful valley to join a fight that wasn't originally theirs. And Doc Morrison himself, the man whose compassion and skill had brought them all together. "What happens now?" Jake asked. 6 months later, Jake Hutchins stood on the main street of Copper Ridge, watching as Doc Morrison's new medical clinic was officially dedicated. The building was larger than the doctor's old office and equipped with the latest medical instruments that money could buy, purchased with the reward money from the capture of Samuel Crenshaw and his gang. Jake himself looked different than he had that night in Devil's Canyon. He was wearing clean clothes and a deputy's badge, having been appointed to assist Sheriff Brennan in keeping the peace in Copper Ridge. The transformation from outlaw to lawman hadn't been easy, but Doc Morrison had vouched for him, and Tom Brennan had provided the training he needed. "Hard to believe it's only been half a year," said a voice behind him. Jake turned to see Sarah Kane approaching, looking far more confident than she had during their desperate escape from Crenshaw's. Bang! She'd been coming to town regularly to help Doc Morrison with his medical practice, and Jake had grown to appreciate her quick wit and gentle nature. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime," Jake replied. "Other times it seems like yesterday." The people of Hope Springs had integrated into the broader community of the territory, no longer needing to hide their prosperous settlement from the outside world. With Crenshaw's gang destroyed and territorial law enforcement strengthened, they could live openly and contribute to the growth of the region. Matthew Kane had been elected mayor of Hope Springs, while his wife, Elena, had started a school that served children from several neighboring settlements. The discovery of their hidden valley had brought new settlers to the area, and the territorial government had officially recognized Hope Springs as an incorporated town. "The doc's looking for you," Sarah said. "He's got something he wants to show you." Jake found Doc Morrison in his new office, examining a medical journal that had arrived on the latest stagecoach from back east. The doctor looked up as Jake entered, his face showing the same kind expression that had first given Jake hope for a different kind of life. "Jake, I wanted you to see this," Doc Morrison said, holding up an official-looking document. "It's from the Territorial Medical Board. They're offering me a position as the regional medical supervisor, overseeing healthcare for all the settlements in this part of the territory." Jake felt a moment of panic. "Does that mean you're leaving Copper Ridge?" Doc Morrison smiled. "No, son. It means I'll be staying right here, but with additional responsibilities. And it means I'll need someone to help me travel to the various settlements and ensure that medical supplies reach the people who need them. Someone who knows the country and can handle himself in difficult situations." Jake began to understand. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a partnership," Doc Morrison corrected. "Half the settlements in this territory don't have any medical care at all. With your knowledge of the backcountry and my medical training, we could change that. What do you say?" Jake thought about the offer. 6 months ago, he'd been a young man with no prospects and no hope for the future. Now he had the chance to make a real difference in people's lives, working alongside the man who had first shown him that redemption was possible. "I say yes, Doc. When do we start?" Doc Morrison stood up and reached for his medical bag. The same one that had been found beside Miller's Creek on the morning that had started this entire adventure. "No time like the present," he said. "I got word this morning that there's a family up in Pine Ridge Canyon who could use our help. Their youngest boy broke his leg and they can't get him to town." Jake nodded and reached for his hat. "I'll get the horses ready." As they prepared to leave on their first official mission together, Jake reflected on how much his life had changed. He was no longer the desperate young outlaw who had stolen bread to survive. He was Deputy Jake Hutchins, partner to the most respected doctor in the territory, with a future full of purpose and possibility. The frontier was still a dangerous place, full of outlaws and hostile territory, and natural hazards that could kill the unwary. But it was also a place where a man could start over, where past mistakes didn't have to define his future, and where doing the right thing still mattered. Jake mounted Dusty and followed Doc Morrison out of Copper Ridge, heading toward Pine Ridge Canyon. and whatever challenges awaited them there. Behind them, the town was bustling with activity as new settlers arrived and established businesses opened their doors. The frontier was changing, becoming more civilized with each passing year. But there would always be a need for men like Doc Morrison, who brought healing to those who suffered, and men like Jake, who were willing to ride into danger to help those who couldn't help themselves. As they rode toward the mountains, Jake couldn't help but smile. 6 months ago, he'd followed Doc Morrison's footsteps into Devil's Canyon, looking for answers about a missing man. What he'd found instead was a new life, a purpose worth living for, and the understanding that sometimes the most important journeys begin when we choose to help someone else. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere ahead, a family was waiting for help to arrive, and Deputy Jake Hutchins, former outlaw turned lawman, rode toward them with the confidence of a man who had finally found his place in the world. The frontier had taught him many lessons, but the most important one came from Doc Morrison himself, that every person deserves a second chance, and that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to reach for it. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake and Doc Morrison rode on through the night, carrying hope and healing to those who needed it most. The frontier was vast and dangerous, but it was also full of possibilities for those willing to work for them. And in the end, that was enough.